Hi, my name is Alex Casano and I'm the events coordinator here at the Clearwater Historical Society. And today we're presenting the history of Largo with Charlie Harper, who is the president at the Largo Area Historical Society. So I hope you enjoy this program. Thank you.
Well, good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Charlie Harper, president of the Largo Area Historical Society. I'm very proud indeed to have been asked to come down and give a little talk to the Clearwater Society about the history of Largo and growing up in this area. Before I start on Largo, though, I got to reminisce a little bit about this city, Clearwater, or as I remember it, a very small city of Clearwater. Let me start with back when I was very young. I remember Mom and Dad would load us in the car, the on-air conditioned car, and like on a Sunday night, we would drive out of Largo and drive up to Fort Harrison and go right past this school and keep going, because even in Clearwater there was very little open on a Sunday night. But north of Cleveland Street on Fort Harrison there was a drugstore, and they had a soda bar. And Dad would take us all in there and we'd all get an ice cream soda or something like that, you know, and then drive back to Largo. Well, that was a big event in those days, in the late 40s or early 50s. But I got so much in remembrance of Clearwater too, because the pram fleet down here that I was a part of, going deep sea fishing with my grandfather on the Sea Fever, which used to, right down here, when you go take the bend around before you go over the bridge, City Auditorium used to be down there, and there was a Clearwater City dock, a wooden dock, and the Sea Fever, which was an old World War II 83-footer, they had converted into a fishing boat, and it docked right there. On that same dock, I caught a great big redfish and with a cane pole, and the Clearwater sun came down and took my picture, holding that fish. About as big as I was back in the time. But anyway, Clearwater and Largo, in those days, Clearwater was maybe 10,000 population and Largo was about 2,000. And they were both small. And it was so nice, such a pretty town, Clearwater, in those days. Going over the Memorial Causeway to the beach at Christmas time. They would have it really lit up and they had big religious signs, you know. And anyway, it was fond memories of coming to Clearwater and then the Clearwater-Largo football games as I got older. But anyway, I have very fond memories of Clearwater, and I'm always willing to share them. And then I go back to saying, Clearwater, rah, rah, rah. Anyway, history of Largo. You wanted me to talk about the history of Largo. And I can sum it very easily. Grapefruit, oranges, old people. That's it. But there is a lot more than that. Let me go back to the very early days. Before even Largo was a town, but I got to set the standard for moving forward. After the First Seminole Indian War, Fort Brooke was established in Tampa in 1824. That was the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, and the idea of that was all the Seminole Indians were supposed to be contained 40 miles from the coast on either side, and from south of Ocala down to the swamps, down to the Everglades. And they built Fort Brooke in Tampa to ensure that the Indians stayed in that area. Well, by 1835, the Indians had had enough, and the Indians started attacking the whites again. Now, none of that took place over here. Major Dade was killed in December, Christmas Day of 1835, and then the Second Indian War erupted, and then there was another one in the 1850s. But because of Fort Brooke opening in Tampa, they had 4 companies of soldiers stationed there. It was a large garrison for those days. 2 young men named McKay served in the Army, and the dragoons stationed at Fort Brooke. And at that time, the soldiers went out and scavenged the land for fish and for wildlife to serve, to eat at the garrison. Well, two of those guys, George and Charles McKay, after their enlistment was up, and after the Armed Occupation Act of 1842, which was to allow 160 acres to any person that would come to Florida in that 40-mile section on coast, from the coast to 40 miles inland on either coast. If they would sign a 5-year agreement that they would work the land and build a cabin and stay on the land for 5 years, the government gave them 160 acres of land. Well, George and Charles McKay, having been used to this area, they remembered it and they came. And they became the first real European settlers, I'll call them that, to settle in what would become Largo. And if you go down Indian Rocks Road, south, you'll see McKay Creek. And on McKay Creek, the 260 acres south of McKay Creek, 1 and then 2, became McKay property. And they were joined later in 1843 by their younger brother, who got 160 acres, and he settled north of McKay Creek. The next people that came to Largo were the McMullins. They came around 1843. One family of the McMullins came from Brooksville. They didn't stay. They went back, but before 1850, 5 more of the McMullen brothers came. And they established properties in Clearwater and Largo, or what places that would be called Clearwater and Largo. As you know, Fort Harrison, which was directly in back of us, stood on the bluff. It was a result of the Seminole Indian War of 1835, the second. And that's how Clearwater Harbor got established. So there was nothing there south of there until when McKay settled. And then a few more people came to the area because of that Armed Occupation Act. And there was about 250 families living in all of what would become Pinellas County. At that time, it was part of Hillsborough County. This was basically called West Hillsborough County. In 1859, a captain of what they called coastal schooners. They did trade between Cuba and Bahamas and up in this area. And they went as far as Mobile, Alabama. One of the established cities was Cedar Key, up the coastline. And of course Tampa. But Fort Tampa sat inland, Fort Brooke. Well, Captain Lowe pulled his schooner, the Sea Wake, into Clearwater Harbor, what used to be called Little Pass, and turned south. And he went down past McKay Creek, where he would eventually build a building, a store. And that store was called Lowe's Landing. So it became the first business south of Clearwater. Lowe's Landing right on the coastline. In 1848, let me back up just a little bit. I missed that one there. In 1848, the Great Gale of 48 came ashore at Indian Rocks Beach and crossed over. It just went right over the island. And one of the McKay brothers, we think it was George McKay, was probably killed in that gale. They said there was about 5 feet of water over most of this area, inland. So Lowe built his building in 1859. They opened a store. In 1859, 1860, and early 1861, the store was beginning to thrive as more and more people moved in. And then we had a little thing called, and you can call it whatever you want, the War of Northern Aggression. The war between the states, or commonly called the Civil War, came about. And Captain Lowe joined the Confederate Army, later the Confederate Navy, and left. He left his family and his young son right there at the store. Well, in March of 1862, a Union gunboat came into Clearwater Harbor, captured 2 coastal schooners that were tied up at the dock at Clearwater. Next morning, they got in their longboat and rowed their way down Lowe's Landing, where there was another coastal schooner sitting, loaded with products from the area that was headed toward Cuba to come back and run the blockade, to come back with supplies for the Confederate Army. So they burned Lowe's Landing in March of 1862, and Mrs. Lowe and their young 3-year-old son, Jefferson Lowe, were hiding in the bushes watching the Union soldiers burn their house. After the war, John Lowe was in Virginia, and he walked from Virginia back to what would become Largo in the summer of 1865. They reopened their store, and things were tough. Things were tough all over here. Nowhere in this area, even Tampa, had declared bankruptcy, the city of Tampa, and it was just a very rough time after the war between the states. In about 1880, something new came to the area. They brought on ships from Cuba citrus, and those citrus plants, citrus trees, the first one to come, they took hold, especially grapefruit in the Largo area, but oranges also and some other citrus. And they thrived. They really thrived. And all of a sudden they had a product that was growing and that they could sell. There was a huge market for citrus up north. But the problem was, how do you get the citrus from here up to the big cities of the north? Well, there was no railroad at that time in 1880, so they had to, everything went by horse-drawn, ox-drawn carts, let's say from Largo and Clearwater, around the bay and over to Tampa and down to the docks. Well, you can imagine the weeks that took to pick the grapefruit, the citrus, to load it, to get it on the boats, and then the boats go all the way around Florida up to the ports of New York. And it took forever. But a little thing called the railroad came along in 1888. It started in actually 1887, coming over from Tampa, the Orange Belt Railroad, and it's made its way across the bay, the northern part of the bay, and into Tarpon Springs. From Tarpon, it came through Dunedin, and from Dunedin to Clearwater, and in 1888, it came to Largo. And then later that year, it went from Largo down to the tiny little town of St. Petersburg. But once they had the railroad, a new world was awakening. Citrus became popular to grow. And names that you'll recognize, like the McMullins and the Taylors, all of a sudden came into being. And numerous other citrus growers. So now they had an outlet, and the grapefruit, like I say, in Largo, really took off. The alkaline in the soil was very productive to grapefruit. As you moved a little bit north up into Clearwater and Dunedin, actually oranges grew better. But it all went on the railroad. It all went to Tampa. Some was shipped north. One railroad line that went up to Jacksonville from this area. They said in those days, around 1900, it was just solid trains constantly moving during citrus packing season. At the same time, cattle they had cattle ranches, believe it or not. You think of that's how the name Florida crackers came into being. They used the whip, the cracker whip that made that crack sound for the cattle. And east of Largo, it's all Largo now, but on the east side, out Elmerton Road, out toward the bay, Clearwater Bay, and not Clearwater Bay, Tampa Bay, that all became large cattle ranches out there. And you've all heard of Starkey Ranch. It's up north. Well, the Starkey Ranch was all of East Largo at one time. And they produced all kinds of cattle. And right downtown Largo, at West Bay Drive in Missouri, where the railroad was the Largo Feed Store. And in front of the Largo Feed Store, which would be backing up on Missouri Avenue nowadays, were all the cattle pens and that. And we have numerous pictures in our collection, all the cattle and loading up the cattle on the trains and that to head north. But it's a lost part of history now. You never think of cattle. Most people still think of oranges and grapefruit. Anyway, you had those names, McMullen, Taylor, Almer, Starkey. They became very famous, and most of them became very wealthy in the process of cattle and grapefruit and oranges. Prior to the railroad, the area of Anona, is everybody familiar with that area? A-N-O-N-A. And that's where, 1859, the area that they first formed down there, it became known as Anona. It was named after an apple that grew in, I believe, Cuba, the Anona apple. But that's the area that first started growing. And that way, right along the coastline, naturally where you would think, along the coastline. After the railroad came, people started moving a little more eastward, away from the coast, and that's how Largo started to grow. In the late 1870s and the early 1800s, early 1880s. And then when the railroad came through, the railroad station was along the ACL tracks. And that's where the railroad station was, and that's where Largo started to grow. That's where hotels were built, and the city started to grow from there. It is a question that will always be in my mind, why Largo did not have the common sense, the people who lived in that area, to at least settle and grow along the coastline. Because Anona started to decrease in population as Largo started to increase. In 1905, Largo became a town. And you asked me, how did Largo get its name? Well, there is the most ridiculous story ever told in the history of journalism. Stan Pekarik published a story in the Largo Sentinel about Largo getting its name from a child named Lulu, and that they were going to name the town of Largo Luluville. I swear I've looked and researched, and I do not know where that nonsense came from, other than it was published in the Largo Sentinel, and that was gospel at the time. Stan Pekarik he was the editor and publisher, and he just was an absolutely trusted individual. So he published it, and it became gospel truth. Let me go way back now, back to 1842, they did the first survey of this area. And they named that lake, it used to be Lake Largo, Tallulah, Lake Tallulah. Sometime between 1842 and 1860, that name was changed to Largo, L-A-R-G-O. Well, the McMullens owned part of the property on the north side of that lake. Now, if you don't know where Lake Largo was, if you go East Bay Drive or come down Highland Avenue down to East Bay Drive, the corner of East Bay and Highland, that would have been the dead center of Lake Largo. And it was a 400 to 500 acre lake. It was a good sized lake. On the 1860 survey, the federal government surveyed all the major port areas of the South because they knew war was coming. So they surveyed Tampa all of Hillsborough County, and like I say, this was Hillsborough County. On that 1860 survey, and we have a map now at the Historical Society that we got from the Tampa Road Department, of all places. And it was called Largo Lake on that 1860 survey map. And we've got a copy of it now, so in my mind that takes away entirely that nonsensical story about Louisville since 1860. Now, where did the name Largo come from? We're still not sure. It's got a lot of meanings. It means slow in Spanish, slow moving water. But the McMullins, who settled on the north side of Lake Largo, were from Scotland. And then they came over and settled into Brooksville and then came south. Part of the McMullen clan was from the eastern part of Scotland, where a couple of towns called Upper and Lower Largo are. Now, we've done research on that too. The McMullins that are still alive today claim they didn't live there in the Largo area. But it's the only connection we have that makes any kind of sense at all, that the McMullins who lived on the north end of Lake Largo named it not Tuluville, but Largo. And that's the story I go with. And I can't verify it, but it's the story I tell. So, in 1905, the railroad came through in 1888, and it was called Largo on the railroad station. So when they formed the city of Largo in 1905, they had to have a name. And what did they name it? They named it Largo. And the population of Largo in 1905 was 297 people. And in 1900, there was 800 people that lived in Clearwater. So it was quite a bit bigger. There was two major employers at the time when Largo formed. One was the John S. Taylor Packing Company, and the other one was the Starkey Ranch. And then all the little businesses that came about as the start of those things. From 1900 through 1925, the Largo Train Depot shipped more citrus out of the Largo Train Depot than any other place in the state of Florida. And like I say, it was mainly grapefruit. It really ramped up in 1914 with the start of the war in Europe. Pinellas County came into being in 1912. So we separated from Hillsborough. One of the main people involved in that was John S. Taylor, the owner of the packing plant. He eventually went on to become a state senator, John S. Taylor. His business ties in Clearwater were numerous. He owned the Bank of Clearwater. He owned, when it was built in the 1920s, he owned the Capitol Theater. And if you know where the Hilton Hotel is on Clearwater Beach, the one just north of the Causeway, right on the ocean, he owned all that property also. And I think his family still owns the property. They leased it to Hilton for 99 years. So John S. Taylor had his business connections. His business was in Largo, but his statewide business connections were in Clearwater. In 1914, now that we're Pinellas County, the Pinellas County School Board issued a building order for its first school built under Pinellas County. And it was the Largo High School that started being built in 1913. It opened its doors in October of 1914. And that building stood until about the middle 80s. And now on that same property is the Pinellas County School Board building on 4th Street in Largo. Beautiful building. So we come into the 1914 time period, and Largo is really starting to grow. I mean, they're up to all the way 1,500 people. And World War I comes along. citrus production is going through the sky. Now we've got to provide citrus not only to the foreign countries, but now to all our soldiers and sailors scattered around, just training and stationed around the world. And citrus and orange and grapefruit production just skyrocketed. In 1917, two young boys from Largo joined the military. They were among 70 from Largo, the Largo area. Now mind you, the Largo area in 1917 was everything from Bel Air Road on the north to the St. Petersburg city limits on the south. There wasn't much in between. And so everything was called Largo. Well, 70 young men from Largo volunteered to serve in World War I. 5 never came home. 2 in particular became heroes. The Heisler Johnson American Legion post in Largo is named after those 2 young men. Ralph Heisler he was serving in France, and in 1918 his company was making a retreat across the river, and Ralph Heisler manned his machine gun until all the American troops were over the river, and he was killed in the process. Back home, his dad was the Largo town marshal. At the time, they didn't have a police force. The other young man, Worth Johnson, we have pictures of him. He was in the Largo High School band. And it appears from the picture, he was just a slight little guy back then. But nevertheless, we've got those pictures of him. He played the clarinet, wasn't it, Marilyn? Played the clarinet. And 2 years later, he would be in a beautiful town in the east of France. And he got caught up in a German artillery bombardment, and he died several days later. He was, in 1920s, his body was brought home by his mother. Ralph Heisler's body is still entombed in an American cemetery over there. In 1918, the war ended. So in 2018, the Largo Area Historical Society took on a major project. And through Marilyn Short back there and Jean and a few other people, we put together a tribute to the ending of World War I. We sent 2 of our members over to France for the commemoration of the ending of World War I. And it got a lot of publicity, a lot of notoriety for our society. But most of all, we recognized our 2 young men that had perished. The American Legion went with our people over there, and they took part in the ceremonies. What was the name of the city, Marilyn?
Lintel, France.
Lintel, France. It was in the mountains. And it went through a lot of the war, but anyway, that's where Johnson was killed. And Heisler was killed at another place. So we're very happy we were able to recognize that as a society and had a lot of notoriety from it. In 1917, go back a little bit now, Lake Largo. I was talking a lot about Lake Largo. Lake Largo was drained to make way for more agricultural growth. And the McMullins owned a lot of that property around the lake, and the county engineer was named McMullen. So they decided they would have the property drained, and the McMullins bought that property. Well, when they drained it, if you go down Almerton Road by the Largo Mall, you'll see a canal there, pretty wide canal. That was the canal that drained Lake Largo in 1917-18. And where did that water go? It went into a place called Long Bayou. Long Bayou in 1950 became Lake Simon. So for every action, there's a reaction, but that's how so many of the places around here got their names, from one reaction, something causing it to another reaction. This sale of citrus went right on. Right after the war, the place was booming. In 1925, Largo annexed all the area from what was downtown Largo out 12 miles into the Gulf. So the properties that we now call Bel Air Bluffs, part of Bel Air Shore, part of Indian Rocks Beach, that was all Largo. And then in 1933, the Florida State Supreme Court, in a lawsuit against Largo, and probably one of the most childish decisions ever made, and you have to read this decision of the 1933 Florida Supreme Court to understand what I'm talking about. But they described the land on the beaches, Bel Air Beach, Bel Air Shore, Harbor Bluffs, the area down Indian Rocks Road. They described that land in 1933. In this century, just what, 80 years ago, they described that land as useless territory that never would be inhabited by any person. That it was only good for the mosquitoes and rattlesnakes, and therefore they ruled against Largo and said that would never be part of a town, and Largo had to withdraw its boundaries back to the original small town of Largo. Well, we all know what that desolate property that mosquitoes and rattlesnake turned into. And it's still to this day hard for me to believe that learned attorneys, well, is there such a thing? Learned attorneys in 1933 could be that short-sighted as not to be able to look forward a little bit. Going way back in 1862, when the federal gunboats ran up along down the coast here, blockading Tampa Harbor, a writer for the New York Times back then, the New York Times was as silly then as they are now, wrote pretty much the same thing about the coastline of Florida. Rattlesnakes, mosquitoes, and no one would ever live there. And I've often wondered if the Florida Supreme Court picked up on that article from 1865 that the New York Times wrote, because it was almost the same thing. When I was a city commissioner in Largo, I tried to get the city commission to go along with me to reopen that case, but our city attorney said, no. They would never reopen that case. In 1921, after the war, the last major hurricane to hit Largo and Clearwater came ashore just north of Clearwater, between Clearwater and Tarpon Springs. It was deemed a cat. They didn't have names for them back then or sizes. Excuse me. But they deemed it nowadays, looking back, they can tell by the whatever damage, they deemed it a Category 3 hurricane. So it was called the Tarpon Springs Hurricane of 1821, and it came ashore in October of 1821. You remember me mentioning the 1848 gale, which was they deemed a Category 5. That came ashore in late September, and 2 weeks later, another one hit the same area. So the major hurricanes that have hit the Clearwater, Largo area have all come in late September or October of every year. And we start worrying about them in June, but they never come this way. The Depression years, 1930. Once again, citrus remained a strong seller in the north. So Largo maintained, in fact, John S. Taylor in 1932 built the largest citrus packing plant in the state of Florida, the Taylor Packing Company. And that went all through the Depression and kept right on going as we built up toward World War II. It's interesting to note, you mentioned Ulmer's, your relatives. They were very famous in Largo. In fact, Ulmerton Road was named after them. Mr. Ulmer, Marion Ulmer, and John S. Taylor, two of the largest landowners and businessmen in the area, died on one day after another in 1935. One day died on a Wednesday and the other one died on a Thursday. So Largo lost two major parts of our history then. Right through the Depression, like I say, citrus kept Largo going, but not much else. It was like every place else. Until 1939, once again, when the war started in Europe. When the war started in Europe, citrus production really picked up again. And the cattle production. By 1941, when America entered the war, Largo entered the war right alongside. In January of 1842, Camp Largo was opened. Now, everyone knows where the fairgrounds was, right? It's where Largo Central Park is now. Camp Largo was formed, and there was as many as 3,500 airmen stationed there. And fortunately, we have found numerous pictures of Camp Largo. Pinellas Airfield, what we now know as St. Pete Clearwater Airport, it later became Pinellas County Airport. But Pinellas County Airport was being built in 1940. The federal government was building it, and they took it over in 1941, and it became Pinellas Army Airfield. Well, all the officers, those that were in for pilot training, they stayed at like the hotel, the Fort Harrison Hotel and places like that. All the enlisted personnel stayed in tents at Camp Largo. But that gun went right, now mind you, the population of Largo was around 1,700, and they had 3,500 airmen stationed there. So I'm guessing if you were a teenage girl in Largo, you had it made. As far as dates, you didn't have to worry about a date. Right through the war, that went right on. Pilots, interestingly enough, the P-51s, the Mustangs, the pilots that left Pinellas Airfield went from here into combat. That was their next, they either went to Europe or to the Pacific area. So Largo was the last place they trained at before going overseas. After the war, things started to change a little bit. Population started going up. And a large part of it was due to those Army airmen that were stationed in Largo and in Clearwater and Dunedin and Tarpon Springs, all throughout St. Petersburg. They all had training bases. Well, those guys and women, mostly men, that went off to war came back, and they remembered this place, this beautiful place down here. And they brought their families with them. And that's how my family came here in 1949. My dad had served in the service, and they came back to Largo. In 1950, Largo's population was hovering right around 2,000. And Clearwater's was about 10,000 by then. So St. Petersburg had started to grow. They had made it up through the Depression, and it was known as the old city of green benches. And they had the pier down there and everything, so it became the largest city. But Tampa was still the major business city. The Tampa Tribune newspaper was the major business newspaper. I remember at the time that in the 50s, the St. Pete Times did not even carry the stock market. You had to buy a Tampa Tribune to get the stock market pages. And not that I owned any stock back then, but I remember doing a report for somebody on it. In 1957, the first of two major freezes to hit Largo, and this whole entire area came about. Happened in December of 1957, and it just about ruined the citrus industry. And things like over on Clearwater Beach, where the parking lot was, right there by the small Big Pier 60, they had a sand parking lot, but there must have been around, 500 Australian pine trees right there. That freeze in '57 killed all those Australian pines. And it also killed all the citrus, or most of it. With the killing of the citrus groves and people moving into the area, all of a sudden the beautiful groves that were in the area were bulldozed down, and now they became subdivisions. My father-in-law was at that time, long before I knew him, he was built subdivisions. He built most of them in what we call Southwest Largo now. But they came in there with bulldozers, bulldozed down the dying grapefruit trees, and right on top of that, they built subdivisions. And that continued on into 1960, when the population of Largo was 5,000. I think by that time the population of Clearwater was about 25,000. A lot of growth. But the people continued to move and come into this area. And then in 1962, on December the 13th, 1962, came the most catastrophic freeze in the history of Florida, at least this area. The temperature in Largo reached 18 degrees. Whatever remaining citrus there was, that killed it. And that ended the citrus industry. The cattle industry had long gone. And now Largo had to turn to something new. Well, for the longest time, it was the building of subdivisions and homes. That's where a lot of the people were employed. The telephone company. It was called Peninsula Telephone. Do any of you from Clearwater remember that? It used to sit on Cleveland Street. As you're going east, you go down a little hill in the road, and then you come back up. Well, Peninsula Telephone sat down there in, what, a 7 or 8 story building? And then it became, from Peninsula, it became General Telephone, I believe, and then whatever it's called now. But the growth of the area, Florida Power, just when you read the history of Florida Power, all the construction crews of Florida Power in the 60s were in Pinellas County building substations and building power plants for the growth. So Largo continued to grow too. By 1970, the population of Largo had increased from 5,000 to 10,000 to 22,000. And now all of a sudden there was other businesses. On Missouri Avenue, which was now a 4-lane road at that time, Kmart opened up, a store named Zayre's opened up, and J.M. Fields. And Searstown opened up just north of there. And I remember a story in the St. Pete Times said Missouri Avenue was the hottest business location in Pinellas County. And now those stores are all gone. There's a Walmart there now, but the Fields and the J.M. Fields and the Zayre's and all that are gone. But electronics started coming along. And all of a sudden you had Major Electronics in Largo. Tech Data, probably the biggest, I think it's the biggest electronics firm in Florida, sits on the east side of Largo. And they employ thousands of people, and there's several other smaller electronics firms. Plus all the small businesses. Largo is home now to the Pinellas County Sheriff's Department, the Pinellas County School Board. The Pinellas County Courts system is all out on in East Largo. And there's one other one, the Pinellas County EMS is now down on Alberton Road. So from where there was what we used to call pines and palmettos, there's a city now of approaching 90,000 people. The city planners call for Largo to have a population of about 110,000, probably by the year 2030, I think it is. So it's going to be just continual growth because there's still some land available. But the apartment buildings that are going up are just, you go down Fort Harrison down into Clearwater Largo Road, and that's where I grew up as a small boy. And it was just small houses and that. And now it's just one apartment complex after another, or condo, I guess you'd call them. That pretty much is the history of Largo. Like I said, I went through it in a big hurry here. But it had the same thing happen to it that happened to Clearwater. The two grew up very much alike with cattle and citrus. Tourism, nobody ever heard of the beaches. I mean, that tourism now that is the mainstay of Clearwater, they built the first causeway, I believe, in 1925 over to Clearwater Beach. But it was nothing. Not until after the war, when the soldiers started coming back, all of a sudden tourism started growing and growing. And Clearwater Beach, my gosh, when we used to go over there, there used to be a thing called submarine races. And those were on the south end of Clearwater Beach, down there where you get your car stuck in the sand too. And the Clearwater High guys would charge the Largo High guys $1 to pull them out. But anyway, that whole place is now hotels. It's so hard to believe how this place has changed in my lifetime. When I give these little talks, I usually go through them, and I go from way back to 1860 to the start of the war, and from 1860 to 1960. Those are the categories I call Largo history. But the 1960 going forward is not recognizable to the people that think of Largo from 1960 going back. And the same thing holds true for Clearwater. So with that, I'll end my presentation. If you got any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
I have one. With the Lewis Johnson building, what was that?
Which building?
The Lewis Johnson building located on, I think
Railroad
that's...
Street, yeah.
Yes.
That started out in 1911 as the Pinellas Hotel.
Oh.
And directly across the street was the railroad depot. So the Pinellas Hotel was right there. The first theater in Largo was a part of that building, just to one side of it. And then right around the corner was the Largo Hotel. The Johnson building is the only one that remains. It's on the. It's the only building in Largo on the historic ledger, and I wish we could get our hands on it. I don't know where the future of that building is going to be, but yes, ma'am.
Going back to 1860, the town fathers knew that the Civil War was about to happen. What was the reason for surveying the area?
Well, yeah, the survey was done by the federal government. It was done because of Fort Brooke in Tampa and because of the harbor of Tampa. They were trying, the federal government wanted to know all the potential locations where the South could bring goods in, especially from Cuba. There was a real need for sugar and salt and small arms. And the European countries could get those to Cuba, and then they would come from Cuba, and one of the first ports on this side was Tampa. Of course, the major one was Mobile and New Orleans, but they had those places blockaded up and down. Well, Fort DeSoto down there remained a Union stronghold during the Civil War. So even though Fort Brooke in Tampa was taken over and Union gunboats bombarded Fort Brooke numerous times, they tried to capture it and never did. There were several skirmishes fought there. And of course, like I said, the one skirmish, 2 or 3 skirmishes actually, that were fought in Clearwater Harbor by Union gunboats that would come in and catch small schooners tied up to the dock here. The Historical Society was formed in 1973. I'm getting my 18s and 19s mixed up. In 1973, one of the senior members is Marilyn Short over there, and her husband Ron. One of the prime members of our board of directors is Jean, right? Jean Beisel. And we have our meetings on the first open house on the first Saturday of every month at the feed store in Largo Central Park. And our meetings are held on the second Monday of every month at 6:30 in the evening, second Monday of every month. We used to have a buffet dinner and then a really great speaker. I have no idea where that's going in the future, but we've already decided there will be no dinners. Hopefully maybe by Christmas we can have a Christmas buffet. But we're changing and we're moving with the times too. We invite anyone to come down and join us. We'd love to show you our little museum, which we formed a new committee on museum collections. We're proud of what we have. I wish we had something like this. You guys should be very proud of this right here.
I just wanted to ask, what about the 1918 influenza? What impact did it have on this general area?
You know, you're asking me questions. Where are you coming up with these? These are good questions. Now I need to research them. I don't know.
Okay, I was just curious.
I can well imagine that it hit this area like it did most areas, but Marilyn, do you know anything about that?
There was a Belcher doctor that was involved in the war at the time. And actually, he died aboard ship in France due to influenza. As
Yeah.
far as the Clearwater history and influenza, I do not know much information.
Those are good questions. I'm gonna have to remember both of those now, look them up. If I can get my computer to work, I'll just work on that. Any other questions? Well then, good. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.